Joe Rogan's new special, Burn the Boats, might be the worst comedy special I've ever watched. That sounds like a bold claim given some of the specials that I've reviewed for this channel. I've watched Amy Schumer, Brendan Schaub, Chris D'Elia, and Joe Rogan himself, just to name a few. By the end of this video though, I believe I will make the case that Burn the Boats deserves to be ranked among the worst, if not the worst special ever made. Going into this special, I was not unfamiliar with Joe Rogan's quote-unquote comedy. Back in 2020, I reviewed his two previous Netflix specials, Triggered and Strange Times. Moreover, I've been aware of Joe Rogan for about 20 years now, due to his association with other comedians such as Doug Stanhope, and his appearances on The Opie and Anthony Show. I've also listened to some of his older comedy specials in the past, and I was a pretty early listener to the Joe Rogan Experience. I'm not going into this blind. For that reason, I was not surprised by Burn the Boats, but I was disappointed. It was almost exactly what I expected it to be. The material was so formulaic as far as Joe Rogan goes that within the first 90 seconds we got a joke about weed.
Because Texas weed is grown on Texas soil, and I believe the soil has memories.
But it doesn't even really make sense because Joe says that smoking weed grown in Texas makes you want to give the land back.
We gotta give this land back.
Thankfully, Joe didn't talk about Texas people partying at the gas station, so it could have been worse. Also, right off the bat, you'll notice that Joe is again wearing one of those absurdly large dress shirts that looks like it came from Patrice O'Neal's closet. This only looks more comical during the wide shots when you can see the entirety of Joe's body. Between the massive shirt, the sneakers from that episode of Doug, and his gigantic noggin, Joe looks like he's about 4 feet tall. It's downright cartoonish. About the first 5 minutes of this special is related in some way to aliens. And I'm not kidding when I say that the centerpiece of this bit is an alien anal probe joke.
The alien anal probe, we all know.
A premise that would have been hacky 25 years ago. Being the comedic genius that he is, Joe turns this trite and outdated joke into a very lengthy and unfunny one.
Make him just all over himself. Just, oh, Jesus! Oh, God! Oh, Jesus!
While much of the material here just feels like the writer's barely disguised fetish territory.
And then I was like, what does that feel like? What if it's your favorite thing? Like,
It does segue into a bit where Joe talks about Fear Factor getting canceled because they made people drink donkey semen. If you follow Joe Rogan for any length of time, you've probably heard him retell this story like his version of Bert Kreischer's The Machine story. A major issue with Burn the Boats is how warmed over all of the material seems. Many of these premises feel years or decades out of date. At one point, Joe is telling a very relatable story about going through airport security while high, and the stereotypically voiced TSA agent tells him that he's been randomly selected for additional screening.
Sir, you've been randomly selected for additional screening.
During the process, she infers that Joe is a man, and he whips out a "did you assume my gender?" joke. In 2024.
Did you just assume my gender?
This is a bit that may have been fresh in 2014 when every anti-SJW hack comic hadn't made it. It was already starting to get stale 4 to 6 years ago. But in 2024, it feels so played out that you wonder if Joe doesn't have anyone around him pointing out that his takes are almost a decade old. There are numerous examples of him telling jokes that feel like they were written in the mid to late 2000s, and Joe just never noticed that anyone made those observations before. For instance, he tells a joke about how squirting is actually piss.
Like, hey man, they've done the research, it's pee!
Watch out, Joe, you're cutting in on Stavros Halkias' territory with that material. In another segment about words you can't say, real original topic there, Joe, he talks about how he wishes he could say again.
It was a fun word! Made conversations more festive.
Then he goes on to say that when people used to say that word, they rarely used it to refer to anything gay.
And if I was gay, I get to use that F word again. Oh, how I miss it so. Rarely did it have anything to do with gay men.
It's a joke he told back on Strange Times in 2018, and even then it was dated. It's also a premise so similar to a joke told by Louis C.K. on Chewed Up in 2008 that I think it borders on joke thievery.
I miss that word, you know. I grew up saying that word, and It never meant gay.
Louis' joke was obviously more funny, of course. A similar situation plays out later in the special when Joe bemoans the fact that we can no longer say the word retarded to refer to stupid people. As part of this quotidian discourse, Joe mentions that you would never use the word to insult somebody with an actual mental disability.
If you're talking to a child that has a developmental disorder, you would never dream of using that word. But if you're talking to a regular grown man who just made a documentary about the world being flat, he's fucking retarded.
Fans of Louis C.K. may recognize this premise from his 2020 special, Sincerely.
Not towards retarded people. Nobody does that. Nobody calls retarded people retarded to insult them. People use it on their friends. Like you're at a bar, your friend's like, I don't have any more money for beer. And you're like, you're fucking retarded. Do you know that?
While talking about evolution, Joe describes how he doesn't think all of us cross the metaphorical finish line at the same time.
I believe in evolution. I just don't think all the monkeys cross the finish line at the exact same time.
In some ways, it was reminiscent to me of Bill Hicks' bits about evolution from fucking 30 years ago. But because it's Joe Rogan, it's far less clever. Joe talks about people banging monkeys and then does some genuinely shameful physical comedy. This is the kind of stuff that should get you banned from ever doing stand-up again. There's another bit before Joe starts to get into his trans material where he discusses how he can't be woke because he was born in the 60s. It reminded me a fair bit of Louis C.K. describing growing up in the 70s and how people were less politically correct back then. But obviously a worse version of that because Joe is nowhere near C.K.'s level. Again, I'm not saying that Joe stole these premises from funnier, more talented comedians. Perhaps it's just a matter of parallel thinking, where Joe is operating on a level so broad that he's creating jokes similar to those written by other comics years or even decades ago. That said, it's at the point where words like laziness and recycling don't really do it justice. This was a problem even on his previous specials, Between Triggered and Strange Times, where he told almost verbatim some of the same jokes, like the joke about how we shouldn't take what the Founding Fathers said that seriously because they were writing with feathers.
It's a stupid job invented back when people used to write with feathers.
You guys didn't write any new shit?
Dude, I wrote that with a feather.
Where it gets really bad on this special is when he repeats a joke almost word for word from a previous special. It comes when Joe is talking about getting caught beating off, a premise that was already pretty lame when Pete Davidson awkwardly mumbled through it 4 years ago.
Everybody does it, but if you get caught, you're a fucking loser. Everyone knows. Everyone's gonna know. Oh no!
Joe seemingly tries to take this into a different direction, akin to something more like a Louis C.K. bit, by describing being caught by his wife when he beat off next to her in bed.
I do tiny strokes to not wake the master.
The problem is this is an almost word-for-word retelling of a joke he told in his 2010 comedy album, Talking Monkeys in Space. I've had my copyright issues with bent pixels in the past, so I'm not going to play the clip. But I will link it in the description or a comment so that you can pause the video and compare the jokes if you wish. Or you can just trust me when I say that they are almost word for word the same joke. Either way, you'd be forgiven for feeling like you've heard a number of these jokes before, because it's possible you have, whether it be on another special or a podcast somewhere. It speaks to a bigger issue with Joe's comedy as a whole. After watching enough of Joe Rogan, you begin to realize that Joe is only capable of talking about the same handful of things over and over again, and he's not very good at reframing them to make his new material stand out from his old stuff. It feels like he's rehashing things because, while he may not be repeating every joke from a previous special, he's kind of retreading the same ideas. Joe isn't evolving, and that's not just a nod to his statistically higher than average Neanderthal DNA.
I want my cave back!
Good comedians have to change over time. It's important to have your own voice, of course, but you have to continue to develop over the years, even after you've found your voice. I don't think it's just an age thing either. Some of the greatest comedians ever hit their stride in their 30s, 40s, and 50s. George Carlin was deep into his 50s and 60s and still continuing to develop and grow as a comedian. Whereas if you look at someone like Joe Rogan, he's been stagnating for arguably decades now. Joe has lived in a Hollywood bubble for 30 years. His only friends are other comedians, Hollywood celebrities, or people with similar hobbies like working out and martial arts. He's no longer part of regular society, so the only experiences he has in common with regular people are decades old. Therefore, he largely has to rely on commenting on recent events or the social issues of the day. As a result, the only area where I think Joe has progressed is, much like Dave Chappelle, devoting increasing amounts of time to his political and cultural grievances. Going into the special, I expected Joe to talk about certain topics and issues. If you've been following him for the last 6 years or so of his slow descent into conservatism, you could predict that he was going to talk about trans people as well as COVID. Because it wouldn't be a stand-up special from a middle-aged man in the 2020s if they didn't proffer their mid-wit opinions on those topics. Now would it? Joe devotes a pretty sizable chunk of this special to talking about trans people. And it's exactly as uninspired and interminable as you imagine it would be. Joe begins this rant by complaining about people saying that men can get pregnant.
And men can get pregnant. Fuck! How did that one slip through?
Honestly though, Joe doesn't really go anywhere with this material, and he doesn't seem to have a broader point beyond saying that this is a new thing that society has accepted. At one point, he's complaining about the pregnant man emoji, because that's a relevant thing anybody gives a shit about, I guess. And he makes one of the weirdest comparisons I've ever heard during a comedy special.
You ever see the regular man emoji? It looks like the guy that Tiger King f***s in prison. Just pregnant man looks robust, like Charles Bronson with a baby inside of him. Like
the closest Joe comes to an actual joke during this borderline incoherent ramble is when he's talking about how unreasonably confident a pregnant man would be. But again, it comes across as the writer's barely disguised fetish.
You got a full beard and you're breastfeeding a baby? Big old thick neck and hairy tits.
Perhaps the funniest thing Joe did during the special is that coincidentally he started sweating directly from his nipples, almost exactly at the same time he's going on this bizarre rant. After watching this godforsaken special a number of times, I've come to the conclusion that Joe only talked about pregnant men as a way to broach the topic he really wanted to talk about, that being trans women. Unfortunately, this bit is also lacking in substance. Joe goes on to say that he's just trying to figure out what's going on. He believes in love and nature and that sometimes you can get thrown a curveball where you think you're in the wrong body, and he supports people doing whatever they want with their body. But after that, he goes on to insinuate that trans women are crazy and repeatedly calls them men in dresses.
But I also believe in crazy people. Suddenly every man in a dress is stunning and brave.
Then he talks about how when he was growing up, killers in movies were always scarier when it was a man wearing a dress.
Psycho! He dresses like his mom, stabs ladies in the shower. Silence of the Lambs! Little Red Riding Hood! The wolf was dressed like a fucking lady!
Personally, I think this material is just transphobic. It's not the kind of thing I would usually say, but I think in this circumstance it's true. When I watched this special the first time, I thought he was simply being lazy, like a number of comedians are these days. This is a topic that, for one reason or another, every middling comedian feels the need to throw their 2 cents in on. Very rarely do they ever come up with something new or interesting, and Joe is really no different. If Joe really was open-minded and wanted to commentate on society, he could have examined how decades of discrimination in media, like the movies and stories he mentioned, have created a negative perception of trans women. But let's be honest, he was never going to do that, for a number of reasons. For starters, he's probably not clever or introspective enough to write a bit that nuanced. The material was scraping the bottom of the barrel. As many times as Joe professed to loving people and just asking questions,
I fully support your right as an adult to do whatever you want that makes you happy. Open-minded! I just want to know what happened.
The jokes almost entirely consisted of pretty vile and negative stereotypes. The kind that I very much doubt Joe would make about any other group of people anymore. It wasn't playful or lighthearted. And it's actually contrasted by some of the jokes Joe made later in the special about gay men and lesbians. While crass and vulgar in nature, those jokes seemed far less intentionally negative in my opinion. They were jokes, bad ones, but jokes nonetheless. Now, some of you may be thinking that I only feel that way because I disagree with Joe on those topics. And you'd be right. The problem with this material is that it's not comedy. It's political grandstanding. Joe is doing little more than pandering to people with similar political views. I find this approach to stand-up comedy to be as shameful when Joe Rogan does it as I do when someone like Amy Schumer does, because that's really what's going on here. At the end of the day, there is very little that separates Joe's material here from the run-of-the-mill fear-mongering about trans people that you'd get out of a benzo-fueled rant by someone like Jordan Peterson. Joe even used the similar idiotic allusion to the wolf in Little Red Riding Hood. Even so, I would still be inclined to attribute this to laziness or Joe appealing to lowest common denominator bigots, were it not for the fact that Joe repeatedly says that he loves everyone and just wants to understand what's going on.
I believe in freedom and I believe in love.
Later on in the show, he makes the point that you can't have equal love without equal jokes.
If you want equal love, you have to have equal jokes, because that's how we find out if you're annoying.
Which is just fucking moronic. Aside from the fact that it sounds like something written on an inspirational cat poster, it's just a nonsensical statement. Joe tries to make the point that if you can't take a joke, you take yourself too seriously. But is that what's really going on? Basically, every comedian of note, including Joe, the biggest comedian in the world, with an audience in the tens if not hundreds of millions, is talking about LGBTQ people. This discussion is not proportional by its very nature. What LGBTQ comedian has an audience of a similar size to tell equal jokes with? I'll wait. Is it really the lighthearted razzing that Joe is presenting it to be?
If we can't joke around about you, we know you take yourself too fucking seriously.
I've never liked the idea that comedians have to punch up, or that certain subjects should be off limits. It's also not lost on me that 5 years ago I defended Dave Chappelle against similar criticisms to the ones I'm making now. But that video was 5 years ago, and we've had a solid decade for comedians to get all of these broad observations out of their system. We have reached the point where it's fair to start calling people lazy for all having similar generic takes on this particular issue. Guys like Joe can't ever stop circle jerking over how they're an elite group of social commentators who decode aspects of society that are too complex for us simple civilians without the wisdom and insight possessed by the likes of Joe Rogan or Bert Kreischer. If you're going to present yourself as an important member of society on par with first responders, then you have to start coming up with better material. If you want to be taken seriously as a social commentator, and these guys desperately do, actually try to find the interesting dynamics in society. Don't just scream, "Isn't that weird?"
I just want to know what happened.
And pretend you're a modern-day philosopher. Come up with a nuanced take nobody else has, one that makes people laugh and makes them view the world differently afterward, not just confirming their previously held beliefs. You're supposed to be one of the greatest living comedians. You should be able to do better. That's the part that is ultimately so disappointing. There's no thought process any deeper than what every other 50-year-old comedian has brought to the table. It feels like it's here because Joe thought it needed to be here, because he's obsessed with trans people, and because he knows his audiences as well. I don't want to turn this into a discussion about Joe's broader political views, because we'll be here for hours. But it seems to me that Joe's beliefs on this matter are set in stone, and I think that is cancerous to comedy itself. I don't think Joe is capable of looking at this from an alternative perspective, so he can't come up with anything interesting or innovative. What we're left with is nothing more than pandering and preaching to the choir. His COVID material is, if anything, even weaker. He spends most of his time talking about how he was misrepresented or misquoted by the media.
If you're getting your vaccine advice from me, is that really my fault?
It generally feels like Joe is trying to deflect any blame for the possible misinformation he may have spread. And he does his shtick of saying he's an idiot who doesn't know what he's talking about, so you shouldn't have taken any of his advice.
That's not my job, kids. I'm a professional shit talker, okay?
Frankly, I find this to be a pretty huge cop-out. Joe knows he's bullshitting here. Maybe he wasn't specifically telling people to take certain medical advice, but for years, this man was speaking with so-called experts on a regular basis, and he himself was often giving out his opinions as if they were based in fact. Anyone who could stomach listening to him at the time will confirm this. It's just disingenuous to spin the controversy by saying he's just a guy who was talking shit in a podcast, when it's the world's biggest podcast, one which people use as a source of information on health and wellness, and he was obviously going to some lengths to try to make these conversations seem legitimate and scientific. Though it may seem like I'm just griping with Joe's political opinions instead of the jokes, it's mainly because these segments of the special aren't particularly funny. While this is some of the worst material from Burn the Boats, it wouldn't necessarily ruin a special if the rest of it was decent. The problem is that the rest of the special is not good. We've already discussed some of the lazy material and potentially reused material, but the stuff that is fresh isn't much better. After watching the special the first time, I sat down and tried to give a raw first impression, but I honestly struggled to remember like a third of it. A lot of the special is pretty standard Joe Rogan-ish material. There's some talk of aliens, there's some conspiracy theory stuff, and there's multiple dude, weed, lamau bits, all of which he tries to spice up with wacky faces and lots of screaming.
Was there even one? You gotta go to that. Maybe the universe is God. What are memories made out of? Like, I wanna sell kayaks! My laptop's in my bag, motherfucker! I gotta live with the swamp people now!
One joke that does stand out to me a little bit is when Joe was talking about visiting the bodies exhibit and how he learned that some of the bodies may have come from Chinese political prisoners.
Chinese unclaimed bodies, which may include political prisoners.
It's not terrible, but it's also another bit that he's talked about a number of times on the podcast. He does manage to eke out a borderline funny premise about what it would be like if somehow he angered the Chinese government and they ended up turning him into one of those exhibits.
4 months later, there's a short guy at the museum with a microphone.
Unfortunately, it's all just in service of doing some half-baked Chinese accent.
Go back to Fear Factor! Oh, you can't! Ha ha!
Joe never quite goes full Mr. Shab with it, but it starts out pretty mild and then escalates to full-on stereotypical.
You look a little sluggish! I'll see you tomorrow! Ha ha! Look at you now, Harry! Riding a bike like a fucking asshole!
And as with most of the jokes on the special, that's the only point. Joe does something wacky with his voice, but the subject matter itself isn't very funny. There is also the sheer amount of jokes where the punchline is more or less about the male anatomy. That's not exactly surprising given that it's a Joe Rogan special, but it seems like he dialed it up considerably for this one.
Still feels like you're touching my dick. How do you touch dicks and not be gay? Does it work? Yeah, try it on me. I can't even come on, bro. They leave their dicks on. Might trick me into sucking his dick again.
You got one warehouse, that's your balls, one delivery truck, that's your dick, and packages are constantly stacking up.
It's all dick. There's a lot of pictures of other guys' dicks on his phone. Do you know about those?
Whatever montage of Joe I played for you, I promise it's a mere fraction of what he actually did during the special. Perhaps even worse than that, Joe Rogan ventures into Brendan Schaub territory with one of these jokes when he talks about how he wishes he was gay.
I wish I was gay. I wish!
You're hanging out with only guys, no one can get pregnant, no more lies!
Schaub actually told a very similar joke on Gringo Poppy, when he said his life would be so much easier if he was gay because he could just hang out with the homies, play video games, and fuck. Now, I don't think Joe actually stole a joke from Brendan Schaub, but it goes to show the level that he is operating on. This material is so lame and played out that even Blumpkin Schlub got to it first, and arguably did a better job. There's more that could be said about Burn the Boats if you really wanted to get down to the nitty-gritty of it all. But I'll be honest with you. The first watch through of this was already a slog, even by the standards of some of the stuff I've watched for this channel. After watching it a second time, I realized there just isn't much of substance to talk about. I've had to go back to my notes and rewatch clips on numerous occasions just to remember what Joe said most of the time. It may have seemed like I harped on the trans material for a bit, but that's because it's arguably the only part of the special that is noteworthy. The rest of Burn the Boats is a blur of forgettable bits, half-baked premises, and moments where it feels like Joe is just whining about being vilified by the media. The issue is that Joe has almost nothing interesting to say, and most of the time the punchline to a joke is just Joe screaming at you.
I'm on my gas station now, pickled alligator dicks and Chuck Norris action jeans, and dudes were dropping like flies.
By the time you reach the end of the special, it's exhausting and headache-inducing.
I fuck and I wait for the Lord. He survived numb, let him fuck.
What really stands out to me about Burn the Boats is that Joe has not gotten better at comedy. A good comedy special should surprise you. It should catch you off guard. But this special had nothing that I didn't see coming. It followed the Joe Rogan formula to a degree that, if you took out the references to recent events, it would be interchangeable with his previous specials from 2018 or 2016 or even further back. He's been doing this for the entirety of his adult life, and it's hard to see that he's made any progress or gotten better. In part, I think the podcast is to blame because he's already regurgitated these thoughts hundreds or thousands of times over the last decade and a half, but beyond the topics, his style is not evolving either. It's screaming every single joke while leaning his head forward and bugging his eyes out, or gurning like an inmate in an asylum. I can't prove this, but I think this special is actually louder than his last one. In my last video, I talked about Joe screaming every joke, but by the end of Burn the Boats, he's screaming everything. Joe shouts every word at the top of his lungs while he turns shades of red I thought were only possible for Perk Angle. Joe's comedy career is living proof that working hard at something doesn't mean you'll get better. And I know some of his ball washers will tell me that he's the most successful comedian in the world right now. But success does not equate to being good. McDonald's is successful, and you wouldn't call it fine dining, would you? Taylor Swift is probably the biggest musician in the world right now, but how many of you think she's really a great singer-songwriter? And I think that might actually be unfair to Taylor, because Joe is far worse at comedy than she is at making music. His success at comedy is really a byproduct of his success at other things, like being on Fear Factor, being a UFC commentator, and launching the biggest podcast in the world. There's a reason it was the first thing he did, but the last thing he became successful at, because he's not very good at it. If he wasn't already famous from multiple other endeavors, his comedy would never be of any note. He wouldn't be selling out arenas across the country, and he would most likely never have gotten multiple Netflix specials. Maybe that sounds harsh, but from everything I've seen of Joe's comedy, I believe it's accurate. And realistically, the special isn't so bad it's good. It's not even worthy of a hate watch. It's not Brendan Schaub blundering through mind-boggling metaphors and losing a 10-7 round to the English language. With a guy like Schaub, his specials were terrible. But at least they were unintentionally amusing. I often find myself thinking back to lines from You'd Be Surprised or Gringo Poppy because they were so bad or so ill-conceived that I can't help but remember them. They still make me laugh, and that counts for something. Burn the Boats doesn't even have that going for it. It's just generally boring and tedious to get through. What makes this worse is that even now, Brendan is still relatively early into his comedy career. The fact that he got You'd Be Surprised after 3 years of doing stand-up was in some ways a mitigating factor for how bad it was. You can't cut Rogan any such slack with this special. Joe has been doing comedy for longer than I've been alive. To put out a special this bad, this deep into your comedy career is frankly impressive. And I don't want to hear any excuses. He's been working on this for 6 years and it was still this bad. Overall, I have some mixed feelings about Burn the Boats, but they go from bad to worse. If I were to judge it purely in a vacuum, I would put it somewhere on par with, or slightly worse than Amy Schumer's The Leather Special. But considering that Joe has been doing comedy for 35 years, and this is his 11th comedy special or album, I have to rank it among the worst I've ever seen. What I find most intriguing about this special is the potential long-term implications it has for Joe and for comedy as a whole. Joe has never been considered to be a top-tier comic, but this is a uniquely bad special for somebody so tenured. That said, Joe is probably too big to fail. He's too deeply embedded in the comedy world. Funnier and more talented comedians aren't going to openly criticize him because it's too valuable to be on his good side. You want to receive that golden ticket of being called up to the podcast and being exposed to his audience. I also doubt that this will be his last Netflix special. They were willing to make him part of their burgeoning live content endeavors, and I'm sure a lot of people watch this special. This isn't a situation like You'd Be Surprised, where Shaw made something so bad right out of the gate that it kneecapped his comedy career. Joe will be able to keep moving forward. I'm not sure what this means for stand-up comedy. When one of, if not the biggest stand-up comics in the world can drop a turd like this with likely no consequences, no criticism from other supposed leaders in this field, what does that mean? When you can invest so little effort into something and be so generic, yet still be rewarded with the highest platform available, what does that say about this medium? While working on this video, I've wrestled with that question, and I don't think I have a good answer. But if this special is any indication of the future, I think we're headed for a truly dark era in stand-up comedy. As always, I want to thank you for watching this video, as well as liking, commenting, and subscribing. I wanted to get this video out there sooner, but I was sick off and on for about the last week of working on it, so it slowed things down. Either way, I hope you enjoyed another expedition into the dimly lit corners of Joe Rogan's Comedy Mind Palace. I'd also like to thank my supporters on Patreon for helping make these videos possible. Thank you. Squirt, Rusty Shackelford, Jackson, Fightback CBD, Mike Roballs, Bone CK, Jonas Namenson, Mad Maxburger, Gaius Nisha Patton, Scott Richmond, Random Candor, Fuzzy Yanus, Dot Old Neon, Timothy Lee Peterson, Julius Caesar Has Jungle Fever, Firebrand, Quasi, Sneps, Alex, Major General John Pope, and Aneem.